Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we have Matthew Laffey with us. He's currently a med student studying at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. And since the pandemic has been put on placement, since the pandemic, he's been put on placement where he's been working in hospitals themselves. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Uh,
I guess just to begin, could you describe why you decided to go to med school and why you decided to study in Ireland?
um, well, two different questions there. Why I decided to study in Ireland is a bit easier. Just the family was moving over there, so it was just convenient. I wasn't gonna go paying for an international education or anything like that. Um, but yeah, why medicine? Um, I don't know. It was just sort of something I was drawn to at the time. I thought it'd be something I'd have an interest in, and yeah, I guess I'll find out, won't I? But yeah.
Yeah, so I'm certain when you discovered that you kind of had an interest in med school and then you eventually entered university, you must have been expecting a little something different than what you're currently under the pandemic. So could you describe how the kind of learning process actually works under the pandemic?
Well, this year, in terms of how the course is laid out, the first 2 years would be very like academic. Like you sort of learn like, yeah, just human like physiology, anatomy, and just what's going on. Whereas this year would be a lot more focused on like, being in the hospitals and gaining actual experience. Like, we meet patients, like do clinical exams, take histories, that sort of thing. Just like, yeah, just work on practical skills really. So yeah, I guess COVID has influenced that like a good bit. Um, just in terms of like who we're allowed to see, precautions we have to take and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, either way, like the university has managed to maintain my placements. I've managed to attend most of the placements. We only missed a good chunk at the start of this year. Like we missed January and February, but overall we've managed to like stay within the hospitals, which has been good for us.
Yeah, so it seems there's kind of a trend in this podcast series where I keep interviewing individuals that are earlier and earlier in their years of experience in the healthcare industry. So I've interviewed a veteran physician, and then I interviewed a nurse, which kind of just started her duties during the pandemic. But I wanted to ask, kind of like as a student still in med school, what are your actual experiences in the industry, like given the circumstances? Do you feel like you're given enough resources to learn under the pandemic?
Um, yes, it depends. I think in terms of like the lecture material and course content, we probably do a bit better this year because like everything is recorded, is provided to us. Um, Admittedly, information around exams is touch and go, but it is what it is. Clinical exposure, um, in ways in terms of like when we are in the hospitals, it tends to be like good because just with COVID efforts, they've like we're sort of spread a bit thinner in the hospital, so to speak. So like there'd be less of us to award, which is obviously better in terms of learning because like we get to see more patients. They're less annoyed when they see us. Doctors have more patients for us. Um, but yeah, obviously there are like logistical problems with if anyone of us come down with symptoms or um yeah, then there are obviously COVID protocols and algorithms we have to follow. But overall, I don't think we're too poorly affected in terms of a learning outcome.
Right. So I'm not sure how long exactly you've stayed in Ireland or if you've been keeping up with like Canada at all during the pandemic. But what exactly is the situation with COVID in Ireland? And if you can comment, like compared with Toronto.
Um, Again, purely armchair epidemiologist here. Um, what's it like? I like in terms of the situation here. I know our cases are. I think I can look it up, but my under yeah are around like triple digits, around 500s. We're like currently still in lockdown and have been since like around Christmas time. Um, but again, we are also But also we are seeing that we do have a vaccine rollout as well, which I know is a bit of a controversial topic in Canada at the moment. Um, like all the we were all vaccinated anyways before we were let back to the hospitals. Um, and yeah, we're just still in lockdown. I don't know exactly what the situation is in Canada. I believe you guys are also in lockdown.
Yeah, we are. We're currently in lockdown, and certainly we have many more cases. But I think in relation to population, I'm not sure what the ratio is there.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think I did want to ask a little bit about what you said earlier. You said you've been placed in many placements working at hospitals. As a student, what actually is your job at these hospitals? What are you doing?
That's a good question. What's it? What's it? To be fair, we don't really have a job per se. Like we don't have any responsibilities. Well, I mean, we have in terms of academic things, we have like procedures we need to do and get signed off, and like we'd be responsible for like we're mainly just responsible for our own learning in terms of like making sure that we get patients to take histories off of and examine, and then asking like medical professionals to like assess us, or like to listen to our histories, or to like discuss patient cases with. Like it would be like the impetus would be more on us to do things. Like it's not like we do have like, well, like this little book full of things we need to get signed off on, but that would be very much considered like a minimum. So yeah, it's pretty loosely defined, to be honest. You just sort of take learning opportunities as they come.
Yeah, so I understand that you recently have been working at Talbot University Hospital. Could you describe kind of your role and what you did there?
Well, to be fair, I've only been recently placed in Tala. So I did 1 week, week before last, where I was on rheumatology in Tala. And rheumatology is basically just anything to do with autoimmune or any of that disorders. Oversimplification, but that's really most of what we see. A lot of arthritis, a lot of arthritis. But yeah, um, during my time there, I almost said like I would be responsible for like going on the ward round in the morning, where like the team goes around and just sort of checks on each patient as to how they're doing, and make sure like that they're following a treatment plan and just getting things ready for their discharge. And then during that, I'd sort of pick out patients that I think would be like good to talk to in terms of whether they'd have like either like an interesting case, or again, a relevant factor is, how willing they'd be to talk to someone. Not all patients have the patience for medical students, which is understandable. But yeah, no, you'd pick out patients and then you'd go see them after the ward round to like take a history, an exam, and then hopefully present that to a member of the team later on.
And in terms of these roles, because I do know that the pandemic has shifted kind of like the healthcare industry in many ways, have your responsibilities being put in placement kind of shifted? Are you expected to perform more tasks, different tasks?
Well, as I said, we're not really responsible for doing anything useful in the hospital, but it would impact things in terms of like you would have to, like, especially in rheumatology, you'd have to make sure that the patient isn't on any major like immunosuppressive drugs before you go see them, because that's really a risk that the School of Medicine doesn't want to take with medical students. Or like just in other things, like I was on like a rotation in respiratory medicine in St. James's Hospital in like yeah last semester, and like I wouldn't have been able to see a lot of the patients because they'd be like, if you've respiratory symptoms like a cough or a fever and you haven't gotten a COVID test, you're assumed COVID until not. So like it would impact the amount of patients I am able to see. But overall, like I still can get patients. So yeah, I guess.
Yeah, so considering that you're still in med school, and you're going into your position working at hospitals during a pandemic, did you feel like you were kind of prepared to go into hospitals at the time and being put into these placements considering the pandemic?
I mean, yes and no, I guess. Like just in general, in terms of ready to go into the hospitals, like realistically, like this is my first year in the hospital, so I wouldn't have been sort of ready, so to speak, to go anyways. Like it's my first time really being in a hospital, sort of learning how things work. Like there were a lot of things about just basic hospital practice that I wouldn't have known before just showing up and seeing it. In terms of preparation, we were given just in light of the current pandemic. We were like there was definitely like an emphasis in like before we were allowed to go on placement that like we were very familiar with like the algorithms and stuff like that in place to in terms of what to do when COVID related things happen. Like what's it like before we go into placement every day, like we have to fill out like an app that says like no, we don't have symptoms, we're not in contact with anyone who's currently has symptoms or is awaiting a test. And like there's a bunch of them. And you have to make sure you have to have that filled in and submitted before you show up to placement. Otherwise you'll be sent home. And like there are stuff like that where like, yeah, they did train us in, but yeah.
Yeah, so I understand that you may not directly deal with COVID patients, but certainly I'm aware that hospitals might look a little different, considering that they are also dealing with the pandemic. How could you describe kind of like what the situation in hospitals look like and what you kind of expected it to look like and the differences there?
Um, in terms of what it looks like and what I expected it to look like. Um, like if I'm being honest, like I wouldn't be the best for noticing changes in hospital practice with COVID because realistically that's sort of all I've seen. Um, but I don't like obviously there are major changes in terms of like algorithms for like on specific COVID pathways. Like if a patient shows up with respiratory symptoms, that has to be dealt with separately. But like overall, like you know, patients are still located in beds on wards. They're still managed through like patient records. They're still seen on morning ward rounds. Like the overall structure of the hospital hasn't changed. It's just security precautions and protocols in place.
And so, as you're still going through med school, and just looking into the future, how do you think the pandemic may have shifted kind of the nature of your profession? And what do you think your occupation is going to look like once the dust settles?
Um, that's a good question. Do you mean in terms of like, I don't know, like what of the adaptations that have been implemented for COVID will sort of stick around?
Yeah, so do you think that, like, given the pandemic, the kind of techniques and methods that are used in hospitals, have they changed? And what do you expect you'll be doing in the future once the pandemic is over?
Um, well, in terms of changes to hospital protocol, um, I'm not sure how seriously it. I mean, there are certain things which I feel like would do well to carry over to the future in terms of like my mum is like a practicing general practitioner, and anyone with infectious symptoms would now like be streamlined so that they do their appointments like not in person. They'd like phone in from the car park, and if they needed to be examined, then they'd dress up in full PPE and they'd do that. And like things like that, like taking potentially infectious patients out of waiting rooms would definitely be something that, you know, potentially may stay post COVID. But I wouldn't say that, like, I would say in general, hospitals do tend to be focused on minimizing the spread of infection in general. Like, so I don't see that there would be, I don't know, I guess revolutionary changes in hospital practice. In terms of how it would influence what I do in medicine, um, I guess that really depends on how long this sort of goes on for and whether my sort of interests in the careers I want to pursue changes. Um, I personally don't see that it would have a huge impact, but You never know.
And I think just as a final question, you will be speaking to like this video will be posted towards a mainly high school group audience. Is there anything you'd like to tell them about working as a med student, working in hospitals and placements? Anything that you think are misconceptions and that you'd like to clarify?
To be honest, I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I can say that it's a lot of work, but I think most people know that. Um, I can tell you that, like, again, a lot of people join medicine because they think it'll be rewarding and interesting, and I'd agree with that, anyways. Um, and yeah, I mean, I didn't enter medicine through traditional pathways that Canadian students would, but I would recommend the course to anyone who is interested in medicine, human health, whatever. Like it's not something I've regretted, is what I'd say. But yeah,
Matthew, thank you very much for your time today.
Grant, thank you. I hope that helped.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Stories from the Frontline podcast series. Matthew has offered an immensely unique perspective on the impact the pandemic has had as both a student undergoing their education and an individual studying off the shores of Canada. Certainly, he has opened my eyes to the diverse and all-encompassing effects COVID-19 has had on everyone. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Our next episode will be an interview with Dr. Alison Yancey, an emergency department doctor that works in Kitchener, Ontario. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.